actually locates the frogs by the echolocation, those pulses, and his hearing too. What do frogs do when they sit up on rocks in a pond or something? Yeah, they croak, and so these bats are actually locating the frogs by their croaks. Vampire bats, don't have any vampire bats here, but if you go down into Mexico, Central and South America, you do. This is the common vampire bat. This guy exists on 2 tablespoons of blood a night. Of course, the ranchers and the farmers in Mexico, Central and South America don't like the vampire bats because they're feeding on their chickens and their livestock and their horses. And the bats tend to go back to the same animal every night, so it can make the animal sick. Although rabies is not a major problem, less than 1/2 of 1% of bats get rabies. They just get a bad rap. Bats get a bad rap just because of the vampire bats are feeding on livestock. So insectivorous bats are feeding on grasshoppers and katydids and moths. And moths are about the only insect that really has any mechanism to detect that pulse that's coming out and going back to the bats as an echo. And they actually are able to detect the bat's echolocation pulse that goes out before the bat can detect it. And of course, it can fly away or dive to the ground. Most insects don't have that ability, so bats are usually 95% or above successful when they go after insects. Bat down in Baja, the bulldog bat actually specializes on fish and locates the fish by that little fin right above the water, makes little ripples. And pool bat, huge gaffing feet. Most bats have little small feet, and these guys have big, big, huge feet. They use as claws, and then they have big old cheek pockets too. They stick the fish into the cheek pocket and usually go hang up somewhere. Okay, now the nectar, pollen, fruit-eating bats. You know, if you go across the border of Mexico and travel south, of course you're going to come into more tropics. And when you have tropics, then you're going to have plants that will attract fruit bats. I do some work down in Alamos, Sonora, which is the northernmost part of the tropical deciduous forest, and there are a lot of fruit bats down there, but it's because there are a lot of plants down there that we don't have here. So if you're in the tropics, whether it's the New World or the Old World, you'll find big old flying foxes or fruit bats in Africa, Asia, Australia, you know, isolated islands, because it is a tropical habitat and the food is there. And these guys feed off of apples and almonds and lots of berries. This guy's a flying fox right here, and they call them flying foxes because they have a canid face, so they look like fox or dogs. Most of these guys have huge eyes because they're actually locating their food with their eyes, which is real different from our bats, our insectivorous bats here. They have very, very small eyes because they're not really utilizing their eyes to chase the insect. Remember, they're using the echolocation. Okay, a little bit about nectar bats now. We've got the 2 species here, the lesser longnose and the Mexican longtongue, and this is the lesser longnose. I was actually with Amy Pate. Amy Pate works for the Park Service. We were down at Oregon Pipe and we were netting bats, and this is a good example of what a nectar bat looks like here in Arizona once it gets covered with pollen. This bat is covered with pollen. And so
yes, he's not normally yellow.
No, they're not. I mean, they look like this is the same species of bat here, just going after hummingbird feeders. So they're kind of grayish. And so this bat was just covered with pollen, which was so cool. This is the other species of nectar bat that we have here. This is the Mexican longtongue. And you'll notice that the rostrum, the muzzle here, is a little bit longer. These guys have a shorter muzzle. They have very, very long tongues, about 1/3 of its body length, and they actually lap up that nectar. And usually, and I mentioned this before, they have a reduced number of teeth, and they have a very long rostrum, and some of them will have longer, and that's the muzzle part, than what we have right here in Arizona. And they'll also go to the hummingbird feeders too. The reason that this lesser longnose bat here has so much of this pollen here, and this bat's probably been feeding off of agave, is because the hairs on this bat protrude and make a good area for the pollen to hang on. So if you're an insectivorous bat, you don't have hairs that protrude and trap that pollen, but these nectar bats do. And this is a good pollination mechanism here that the bats have. The bats that are feeding on nectar and pollen, it's a complete food for the bats. If you're a hummingbird, you're feeding on nectar flowers, but you're also catching a lot of insects for your protein. But bats have stomach digestive juices that actually transfer the pollen into protein, so it becomes a complete food for the bat.
Can I ask something here?
Yeah.
Can they get the pollen from their fur to their mouths somehow?
Oh yeah, yeah, they groom. And so what they do is they'll use their wings, they'll use the thumb, and actually, and actually ingest it. And a lot of that's going to fall off too as they go from plant to plant to plant.
Invest in the protruding hairs, I assume they themselves have a benefit from it.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah, they're gonna lick. And what they do is
okay.
they groom each other, they groom themselves, and they hang upside down. Remember, they have that very, very long tongue, so that long tongue
So do
is
they-
a third up the body.
Where does the tongue go when the mouth is shut?
What does the tongue what?
Where does the tongue go when the mouth is
Is there
shut?
any roll-up mechanism like a woodpecker has?
You know,
Never
they
seen that in
don't,
mammal.
that's a good question, and I'll check, because hummingbirds have what's called a hyoid apparatus
Right.
that wraps
It
around
wraps
the
around the
inside of the skull.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, I'll check and let Joe know. That's
Do they?
good.
But do they actually ever bite or chew the anthers for the pollen, or they wait
Not-
and get it vicariously when they groom themselves?
Yeah, and not that I know of. And another thing, these guys too, even though, you know, Amy's holding it with a glove there, they're usually not biters. They don't have carnivorous teeth like, let's say, insectivorous. You know, I'm not going to ever handle an insectivorous bat, you know, without gloves. These guys are so mellow, their teeth tend to be broader rather than the pointed carnivore type teeth. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't think they do. I haven't ever read anything that I mean, they're getting their protein from the pollen,
Right.
and they're just ingesting it as they groom. Usually nectar bats use their vision more so than, let's say, I mean, the saying blind as a bat doesn't apply to any bats. Bats see just as well as you and I. They don't see color. They don't have cones, so they're not seeing color like we do, but they can see. And they use their eyes to move around the roost or, you know, look at things around it. But when you're out there chasing insects, it's not, you know, much use to you when you're flying around in the dark. These guys, you see their eyes are fairly big, not as big as, let's say, a flying fox, but they are using echolocation to a certain extent, like you know what I told you when I was sitting out there and watching agaves for hours upon hours. They do use their echolocation to fly, you know, and maybe find a plant, and then they revert to the eyes. Very good sense of smell. I have some better photos in just a minute, but most nectar bats have what's called a leaf nose, and you can't see it real well there, which aids them in finding the plant. For these guys, it's not unusual, especially, I'm going to show you a roost in northern Sonora that I've been monitoring since 2002 in just a minute. I have a good slide for it. But there's nothing out there. It's Lavatus is out in the Penacati Reserve, and there's no food out there at all. And so the bats either have to travel east or maybe come into the U.S., which they are. A lot of them are coming into Oregon Pike. But 35 miles one way is nothing for this bat. It's a very long-winged bat. It's kind of like a falcon, and these wings here are much longer than, let's say, a bat that maybe hibernates and stays active during the winter. We do have some insectivorous bats here. So if you're an animal that flies fast or long distances, you're going to have longer, more narrow wings. That's kind of equivalent to what, you know, a falcon would have for that speed. Okay, this is a fruit bat, and this is a fruit bat. This is Artibius hirsutus, or common fruit bat that I caught down in Alamos. You can see his leaf nose here. You can see some ridges in this bat here. So, you know, I'm working down in Alamos, Sonora, and I'm picking up a lot more fruit bats. And we don't have that guy here in Arizona. But this is the,